sleeps in his coffin for centuries, then suddenly rises up in the middle of the night to feed on the blood of the living, the vampire. Hailing from the depths of time, known to all cultures, fascinating and repulsive at the same time, not quite dead, but never so alive as during history's most turbulent times. A reflection of our society, metaphor for our monstrous side, the bloodthirsty nightwalker has endlessly evolved. It's as a novel's hero that the vampire would become one of the most subversive and phantasmagorical of characters of pop culture. It all began with an astoundingly rich novel published in London in 1897, whose success continues to this day, adapted hundreds of times for theatre, movies, literature, or comic books. A creature of the 19th century, the Romanian count imagined by the writer Bram Stoker became the modern model for the vampire, set forever in our imaginations.
Within stood a tall old man, clean-shaven save for a long white moustache, and clad in black from head to foot.
Count Dracula?
I am Count Dracula.
The old man motioned me in with his right hand with a courtly gesture, saying in excellent English, but with a strange intonation, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own free will."
This is how Dracula first appears in Bram Stoker's words. Jonathan Harker, the novel's hero, is a young English solicitor sent to Transylvania to settle some business with a mysterious count. During his stay in the ominous castle, the young man discovers the count's strange nature, still unaware of what a vampire is.
He's not a demon or a divinity, but a living dead. Someone who has lived and died without rights, or who died violently and became a revenant. Compared to ghosts, he has a body and can cause physical harm to others.
He isn't dead because he has no soul. In all established religions, you need a soul to die. Without one, he can't die. It's not the same as a wandering cadaver. He's someone who came back after his death as he'd been before. But he's the only creature who isn't bound to the curse of going to heaven or hell.
He's a human who has lost part of his humanity in exchange for something else. Vampires gain immortality, but lose the company of men to become their predator.
Vampires can live endlessly, can even get younger, so long as he drinks his victim's blood. Blood, the vital fluid, this most ancient, sacred, and universal of symbols. Paradoxically, it's also the bearer of death. It contaminates and carries diseases, or it can make one a vampire. Dracula has a double-edged bite.
Dracula is a real menace to men. If he takes their blood, they become like him. He doesn't just feed on their necks. He needs not exactly slaves, but adepts. In fact, he's an epidemic. For Bram Stoker, it's clear that his vampire wants to dominate, or even enslave the world.
Held against his will in Dracula's castle, Jonathan Harker gradually uncovers his host's terrifying powers.
I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over the dreadful abyss. Face down, with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings.
Dracula can transform at will into a bat. But also into a wolf. He can take on the appearance of a light fog and glide under a door. And his incredible strength makes him even more frightening.
You can control me.
And since vampires have no reflection in mirrors, he can take you by surprise.
The Holy Grail is the absence of reflection. Bram Stoker invented it first. Stoker doesn't dwell on it, just one sentence. Jonathan Harker is shaving the morning after his arrival at the castle. He has a pocket mirror in front of him, and someone says, "Good morning." Behind him is Dracula, but when Harker looks into the mirror, there's this wonderful sentence, "There was no sign of a man in it except myself." We are the evil. Let's question ourselves. Why do we seek scapegoats? Why do we seek excuses for the evil we do? Freud is starting to stumble through the unconscious at the time, as Bram Stoker introduces it in his novel.
Good morning.
It's a fear of the animal nature in us. We refuse that part, but it's there, dormant and underlying in our personality.
The predator who hunts and kills is scary. It's the fear of dying. But there's also that side of him that has vanquished death, that has crossed the threshold and endangers everything we believe in. Particularly this idea that life after death takes place elsewhere.
Jonathan Harker, the novel's hero, notes all the terrible phenomena in his diary. Though he can't escape from Dracula, he understands that it's possible to keep him at a distance. Harker learns this by chance when he cuts himself shaving.
When the Count saw my bloody face, his eyes blazed with a sort of demoniac fury.
You've cut yourself.
And he suddenly made a grab at my throat. I drew away, and his hand touched the string of beads which held the crucifix. It made an instant change in him.
Dracula can't be touched by holy water, or thorns, any of the Christian symbols.
He doesn't have absolute power. He's only a vampire if he follows a series of rules. The most outrageous one in Stoker's novel is that vampires can't see the sun, that he's burned by sunlight and can only live by night.
Bram Stoker was writing at the early age of electricity and gas in cities. Streets around the world were dusky places where anything could happen. Furthermore, daylight is God, and the vampire is opposed to God. He's given the night.
Another well-known way to keep him at bay is simply garlic.
Garlic shouldn't stop a vampire. Garlic gives bad breath, and it's good for the heart. I don't understand why something that encourages blood circulation would be bad for vampires. It's just a limitation, or vampires would become gods we can't resist. They'd eat us all, and that would be that. So their abilities need to be well defined, as do their limits, so that we might stop them.
Stoker's novel laid out the codes for literature and later movies. And whenever we think of vampires, we think Dracula.
Risking his life, Jonathan Harker is finally able to escape Count Dracula. The vampire himself leaves the Carpathians, traveling by boat to England, where he hopes to spread his curse. He reaches Whitby, a small seaside city, where Harker's fiancée Mina is on holiday with her friend Lucy. Dracula quickly notices them. One night, he draws Lucy into the cemetery. Noticing her absence, Mina sets off to search for her friend, and she later describes finding her.
Mina Murray's diary, August 10th, 3 a.m. I was now close enough to distinguish it, even through the spells of shadow. There was undoubtedly something long and black, bending over the half-reclining white figure. I called in fright, "Lucy! Lucy!" And something raised a head, and from where I was, I could see a white face and red, gleaming eyes.
Stoker is the first author to use characters' diaries to create his novel. And he goes further still by including press clippings, telegrams, notes. He creates his story out of a sort of patchwork.
Very modern in its form, the novel takes many different viewpoints of the vampire without ever having him talk, making the character even more complex and fascinating. Yet in reality, the myth of the vampire did not begin with Bram Stoker's work. It can be traced to the furthest points of antiquity with no single origin, as it is often the case with myths and legends.
Bram Stoker's Dracula brings together about 3,000 years of mythology. Roman, Greek, Middle Eastern. They all have vampire stories. The Latin Lamia are vampires. There are Celtic vampires.
In the Western mind, we started talking about spirits in the 12th century. They would come back to haunt their families and beloved, and eventually suck their blood. And since there was no term for them, we'd call them sanguisugae.
In Latin, literally, bloodsuckers. It was in the 18th century that the definitive term for this sort of malicious character was set, the vampire. It is a fairly mysterious word, most likely coming from the Slavic upir, which means bad. The figure of the vampire would first appear in early 19th century literature, more precisely in 1816, by the banks of Lake Geneva, where a few young British romantic poets were staying, Lord Byron and his friend John William Polidori, Percy Shelley and his wife Mary.
The weather was poor, and so everyone would spend the day preparing a story to tell the others that evening. With no TV or radio, they told stories instead. So Mary Shelley invented Frankenstein, and Polidori invented the first true vampire character, an aristocratic bloodsucker.
Byron only sketched out the character of the decadent dandy aristocrat, which would serve as a model. It was Polidori who wrote The Vampire. Yet it was published in 1819 under Byron's name. 1 year after Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the story of a modern-day Prometheus who, with a cadaver and a bit of electricity, gives life to a monster. Without prior consultation, these young authors had simultaneously invented two of the modern era's greatest myths.
Frankenstein becomes sci-fi's model robot. The robot does the work. On the other side, the vampire doesn't work. He sucks our blood while we work. He's the aristocrat, the landowner, the profiteer who lives off our labor. It's remarkable to see how these two figures, conceived at the same time, remain today organizing paradigms that can be found in current TV series and beyond.
Key works of the Victorian era, The Vampire and Frankenstein, anticipated the changes that would stir the 19th century, exploring humanity's duality, the light and shade in every human. Just like Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that would appear 7 decades later.
I think it's a spiritual reaction to rationalism. Rationalism brought the Industrial Revolution, the objectification of men, their transformation into a cog in the machine. Mr. Hyde escapes that objectification, as does the vampire, and even that unhappy creature, Frankenstein. And that's just when Bram Stoker arrived.
Business manager of London's Lyceum Theatre, Bram Stoker was not a full-time writer. He would take 10 years to write Dracula, his 5th novel, meticulously researching its context and content. A product of its times, the novel synthesizes all the previous history in fiction, including Stoker's reminiscences of Ireland, where he'd been born 50 years earlier.
He was sick throughout his childhood. He was bedridden and had no contact with the outside world. His only distraction was to read and listen to his mother's Irish legends. Dreamlike, magic, extraordinary. And that was the font of his imagination. Because it's clear that in the stories he wrote 30 years later, there are traces of his mother's stories. It's this unusual environment of his youth that marked all the rest.
But not only that, in 1888, Stoker was shocked by Jack the Ripper's nefarious exploits. The mysterious serial killer terrified all London by slaughtering 5 prostitutes. Crimes that would never be solved. The murderer never identified.
Dracula has a similar elusive character. Someone who can kill out of the blue with no consequences. It was a big source of inspiration for Stoker.
Dracula captures Britain's biggest fear, a leading world power throughout the 19th century, an empire upon which the sun never set. Britain had a fear of decline.
It was the beginning of the end of the colonies. Britain was less powerful. The empire was starting to crumble, and the danger was coming from outside.
Dracula is from Romania, far-off lands where people rarely went and only at great risk. He comes to London, he's a stranger. He's not us, and we don't want him to be. The vampire is the other.
Incredibly enough, soldiers were packed after World War I with Stoker's novel. It sort of warned them against the enemy, to get them primed for fighting foreigners, to blame all the world's ills on the other side.
Bram Stoker died in 1912 without ever knowing how the army used his creature for propaganda. Though the author of many novels and stories, posterity would remember only his major work, Dracula. The book only had a moderate success upon publication. It was after the author's death that the character's destiny became really exceptional. Born at the same time as cinema, it was inevitable that the two would meet. and that's where Dracula's myth would evolve from there on. Germany, 1922. It was time to exorcise the horrors of the recent conflict, the black hole that had engulfed the world. Time to confront the anguish and fear the monsters may yet return. It was time for Dracula to take form on screen. Well, not exactly. To avoid paying adaptation rights, the director Murnau transferred the setting to Germany and changed the characters' names. Dracula became Nosferatu.
It was a terrible appropriation. And when the film came out, Bram Stoker's legatee, Florence Stoker, sued Murnau, of course. And she won. And Murnau and the producers were ordered to destroy all the prints of the film. We're lucky that one print slipped through, or we might not know the film, and that would really be a shame, since it is the most beautiful and faithful of the adaptations. Playing Nosferatu, Max Schreck appears as a thing of horror. It's not clear if he's man or animal. There's a very negative image of a vampire.
Murnau pushed the animal metaphor to the extreme. A multitude of rats accompany Nosferatu, a tangible reflection of the danger he poses to society, contamination and death.
He carries a real plague. He's really the alien, someone not human, with whom we absolutely can't identify.
And yet, by taking liberties with Stoker's character, Murnau suggests a certain fragility to the vampire, as monstrous as he remains. Unable to contain his irrepressibly intense desire, Nosferatu comes to neglect his survival instinct, and dawn catches him in full embrace. This scene of self-destruction invites pity as much as horror for the monster. Nosferatu would even resuscitate about 60 years later, embodied by Klaus Kinski and directed by Werner Herzog. As movies were mutating from silent film to talkies, the monsters returned. Whether by making us laugh or feel afraid, they allowed us to exercise the traumas of history. The world was cracking all over. The crash of '29 and the Great Depression forced millions of jobless into the streets. The rise of dictators was clouding Europe's future. And Dracula rose back out of his coffin, this time in an authorized adaptation, played hundreds of times on Broadway by a Hungarian actor.
I am Dracula.
With a new and clever prop, a big black satin cape, which made it possible to hide the mechanisms that would lift him above the stage. In the 1931 film directed by Todd Browning, the actor Bela Lugosi provided a new image of Dracula as a worldly vampire, fangless, and with no resemblance whatsoever to a monster.
Dracula was Bela Lugosi, a fairly unwholesome character, but who's also somewhat elegant and always in evening attire and a big cloak. He's a sort of sinister Don Juan, quite the opposite of Stoker's idea of the vampire, who was not a seducer at all, just the pure incarnation of evil.
While remaining a more or less demoniacal being who inspires disgust, he also has this strange power of seduction. He looks in people's eyes and they crack. I think it's a variation on the theme that the vampire isn't violent towards his victims. He seduces them, and at the moment that he bites his victim, they consent, if only in thought. The victim feels the vampire's presence and says yes, despite themselves.
At the heart of Dracula lie unconscious impulses. It's a novel of frustrated sexuality in which the vampire, man or woman, serves to reveal Victorian morality's repressed libido.
Jonathan Harker's diary, May 16th. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive. I could feel the soft, shivering touch of the lips on the super-sensitive skin of my throat, and the hard dents of two sharp teeth. Just touching and pausing there, I closed my eyes in languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart.
It sounds like an orgy. There are 3 women at the foot of Jonathan Harker's bed, and they say, look how big and strong he is. He could satisfy all 3 of us. Who goes first? It's daring for the time. For its era, it's an erotic novel. Jonathan Harker is on edge. He'd like them to bite him, but he feels guilty because he's engaged to Mina. He tells himself, it's a dream, not reality, since we're not responsible for our dreams. He could let himself be bit. In a way, Bram Stoker also invented fantasy, a dream that we don't dare to wish coming true.
The vampire embodies 2 fundamental anthropological desires. Thanatos, the desire for death, but also eros, the desire for sex and the forbidden, that we clearly see in Stoker's Dracula with the supernatural metaphors. The vampire makes it possible to talk about sex at a time when it was not openly discussed.
At that time, England was trapped in a Victorian corset and needed something powerful to bust the laces. Only a vampire would do.
Saved at the last minute when the Count arrives, the young man escapes from being bitten. His honor is saved in Stoker's novels and the films. Bela Lugosi would be the embodiment of Dracula for many years. It is said that he was so obsessed by the role that he took himself for a vampire. He asked to be buried in his cloak upon his death in 1956.
This could be the beginning of the end for the human race.
By the end of the 50s, the horror films that had been so popular pre-war had long fallen by the wayside.
The whole world is under attack.
The Cold War called for science fiction and atomic monsters.
We know now that we can't beat their machine.
The Predator had become an invader from beyond. The vampire was sleeping in his coffin, but only for a wink. In 1957, England's Hammer Studios chose to relaunch the classic monster stories in Technicolor.
This is the story of Dracula, a creature who destroys all whom he touches. Dracula the terrifying, the feared, who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night to inflict his terror upon the innocent and the unsuspecting.
It was a brilliant throw of the dice. Nearly 140 years after their birth on the banks of Lake Geneva, Hammer Films had brought back both Frankenstein and Dracula, played surprisingly enough by the same actor, Christopher Lee.
Christopher Lee had a real presence. He was very tall, incredibly talented. He had that sadistic side that is very close to Dracula in the book. He wasn't handsome, because Dracula isn't in the book. He's fascinating, like Christopher Lee, who had a fascinating ugliness. He's my favorite Dracula.
Action.
For me, it's Christopher Lee who really incarnates Dracula on screen. He's cold, cruel. He really did research to make his character like Bram Stoker's, but with that little something extra.
Christopher Lee raises the vampire's erotic and sexual dimension. Dracula becomes a sort of sexual icon, seducing married women, young girls, even men. Nothing is forbidden, and that's what makes him dangerous to right-thinking society. Nothing can stop him.
He's also a hope of liberation, since what was taboo becomes permitted. It's the beginning of a period when the vampire will be released of all the ills he'd been blamed with.
Hammer films draw impassioned responses, and the defenders of morality line up. With Christopher Lee, it becomes terribly desirable to be bitten. But is it a bite or a kiss?
A kiss is like a bite, but without the teeth. In the past, before people started kissing, they would bite. In Ovid's most sublime book, Amores, he hits a woman in jealousy, then immediately regrets it. He goes home and writes the first known text against violence against women. He says, look, guys, don't hit the women you love. Instead, leave the mark of your caressing teeth on her neck. That's a bite, the synonym of the kiss. It's an act of love. In French, we have even kept this metaphor. For us, to be bitten is another way of saying you're in love.
The vampire's fangs sinking into his victim's neck. It's obviously a metaphor for penetration. The blood is the broken hymen. There's this whole ambiguity around the mouth. The lips that are soft, and the fangs that are just behind them. There's the pleasure and pain of the vampire's kiss. There's both at once.
October 3rd. With that, he pulled open his shirt, and with his long, sharp nails, opened a vein in his breast. When the blood began to spurt out, he took my hands in one of his, holding them tight, and with the other seized my neck and pressed my mouth to the wound.
Take from me. Take.
So that I must either suffocate or swallow this.
Drink.
Oh my God, what have I done?
There's also something regressive about feeding on a partner. Freud will call it a stage before sexuality, or a stage of infantile sexuality. The dream of devouring the mother, and perhaps being devoured by her.
Obviously, the success of the vampire myth comes from these strong echoes towards a deep psychoanalytic state.
In Stoker's novel, the vampire, incarnation of sex and perversion, is defeated by his valorous adversaries. Back in Whitby, Jonathan Harker is committed to eliminating Dracula with the help of his friends. Representatives of morality, they still need the help of an expert, Dr. Van Helsing, an old Dutch professor, and the only one who knows how to overcome this creature. They start by confronting poor Lucy, who was killed and transformed into a vampire by Dracula's bite.
Dr. Seward's diary, September 28th. Van Helsing, with his usual methodicalness, began taking the various contents from his bag and placing them ready for use. First, he took out a soldering iron, then a round wooden stake. One end of it was hardened by charring in the fire and was sharpened to a fine point. With this stake came a heavy hammer.
Until the 70s, the vampire embodied change. He was the one who upset the order of things, and at the end of the film, he's been destroyed. That's why those fighting him are still on the side of good, defending moral values against the destruction of the monster.
Christopher Lee returned as Dracula in 8 more films. But in the meantime, the youth freed themselves and society changed profoundly throughout the 60s. By the end of the decade, compared to sexual liberation and the new counterculture, the vampire had lost his subversive effect. While paying homage to the Hammer films, Roman Polanski was the first to desacralize the myth in 1967.
Who says vampires are no laughing matter? They certainly are.
Dance of the Vampires explores themes more in tune with the era. Polanski's vampires are homosexuals or Jews, and they triumph in the end.
It's the only film that is completely irreverent about vampires. And it's also the only film that everyone knows. If you ask people on the street for one vampire film, 9 out of 10 would say Dance of the Vampires.
Dance of the Vampires takes Bram Stoker's codes and adds humor. It's not that easy to mix humor and vampires without ridiculing them.
Dance of the Vampires opened the way for a slew of parodies and comedies that would jostle Dracula's image.
Drac is back. You haven't seen Kung Fu until you've seen the 7 brothers against Dracula.
He was a global star, adapted in every country, in every style, and for every sort of audience.
Quel vampire?
During the 70s, the Prince of Darkness had a hard time overcoming the misuse of his image and the increasingly improbable adaptations. Yet after all that misuse, the figure of the vampire would be reborn once again, completely metamorphosed through literature.
The vampire really changed when we started taking his point of view. With Bram Stoker, the vampire is the other, not us. We don't want him to be us. With Anne Rice, we're in the vampire's point of view, quite literally in his skin.
Published in the US in 1976, Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire was a stunning global success and was adapted to film 20 years later by director Neil Jordan and starring Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise. Its hero, Louis de Pointe-du-Lac, tells his life story to a journalist in a sort of self-analysis that reveals a vampire tormented by his condition and who refuses to kill humans to survive.
Anne Rice keeps some of the codes of the vampire story, but she turns him into a sort of Superman, perhaps just as frightening or worse still, and yet we grow fond of him.
And then you start thinking of the vampire no longer as a predator, but almost a victim, which is a very interesting switch.
Louis is a vampire constantly struggling against his nature and his need for blood. Opposite is his companion, Lestat de Lioncourt, who has no qualms about his condition.
Lestat is really an erotic character. He inspires desire, plays with it, only lives for desire, which justifies everything else. In Anne Rice's novel, the need for blood is both a limitless sexuality that always nags at the vampire, but also undoubtedly a drug. It's a way to have unparalleled pleasure, not available in daily life. What becomes frightening is the danger of a life organized by desire.
Following the initial success, Anne Rice wrote several more volumes about the unusual couple formed by Louis and Lestat. Throughout the 80s, the two vampires were icons for a gay community, finally coming to light as well, and yet about to be struck by an unfamiliar illness.
I sincerely believe that vampires match their era. What I mean is that each vampire apotheosis is a moment when we're living through an exceptionally difficult period, a time associated with death. We were in the middle of the AIDS epidemic, and so many people were dying. Some people were spending more time burying friends than hanging out with them. And the metaphor around blood and giving blood within the novel is obvious.
The vampire evolves with society. The more it becomes tolerant, the more the vampire becomes human, less dangerous, because he himself is ill at ease and tortured, which is unthinkable. It's a bit the same for all minorities, which I think is why, over the years, the myth of a vampire has not weakened.
'80s nihilistic youth weren't afraid of vampires. On the contrary, they were inspired by them. Advocating giving up day for night, refusing conformity, and embracing garish aesthetics. The terrifying monster was buried, replaced by a romantic hero in its own right.
The vampire is a maverick, a libertarian, someone who doesn't need to mix up with normal society, somebody who is free.
He may be the greatest anarchist that exists. The vampire knows no government, just his hunger that he may eventually master. The vampire crystallizes our thirst for independence, to not conform to the usual social rules. And of course, it's fascinating.
Almost a century after his publication, the original Dracula returned to theaters in 1992 in a new adaptation. Francis Ford Coppola claimed to deliver the closest adaptation to the novel, calling his movie Bram Stoker's Dracula. Yet he also modifies it. Interested foremost in the Count's human identity, the real man that Bram Stoker had been inspired by, Dracula, or Vlad Tepes, known as the Impaler because of the punishment he inflicted upon his enemies. A Romanian lord of the 15th century, he battled the Turks and reaped terror. Given 2 pages in the novel, his story became Coppola's central theme.
Coppola explains for the first time how and why Dracula became a vampire. It's because he lost his wife. The pain made him become a vampire by rejecting religion. And this set him on a life of adversity and marginality.
He freed himself of everything, even if the price was this solitude, this never-quenched thirst for love.
We're taken with empathy for the vampire because we see that his immortality causes him suffering, like a burden. The loss of his beloved becomes something difficult to live with for the vampire, who lives eternally with his memories.
Coppola's Dracula is an unhappy vampire who carries his pain for 4 centuries until the Victorian period. The film then picks up with the novel's plot, but then strays again as Dracula recognizes his lost love in the photo of Mina, Jonathan Harker's fiancée. He comes to England to find her, and she falls in love with him.
In the end, it's finding her that allows him to understand that he's left humanity and that their love is impossible. It ends when she kills him. And then she says that, by doing so, he'll find peace.
I shall be glad as long as I live, that even in that moment of final dissolution, there was in the face a look of peace, such as I never could have imagined might have rested there.
The vampire is a way to understand the notion of eternity, death, and the finiteness of life, and the cost of immortality, what it would be like to live forever, and whether that's finally bearable.
One of the aspects of the vampire is this ambiguous relation to immortality, since it grows wearying. The idea of boredom comes back in vampire stories. For example, in the series True Blood, the vampires are old and bored and lose their taste for life. They know everything and can escape death, but are only more worried because of it. There are vampires that end up committing suicide precisely to understand this one thing they've been close to without ever truly knowing.
In the end, the vampire represents humanity because we are the vampire. It's the projection of our fears and desires. There's this plasticity that allows him to become anything we want, all that we'd like to be, and at the same time, all that we're afraid of being, all that we're not and will never be.
What I desire.
Yes, my count. Pizza.
You had garlic bread pizza delivered.
Of course not, silly. It's not delivery.
Over more than a century of existence, Dracula has become a familiar icon, fixed in his codes. The figure of the vampire has continued to evolve, inspiring countless novels, films, TV series, and onto new media outlets, adapting to young audiences. Ever adjusting to the era, the vampire has been through everything at the risk of getting lost along the way. In 2005, the American Stephanie Meyers published the first novel in a series that would become a global phenomenon. Twilight sold over 29 million copies and became a box office hit, at the center of a true collective hysteria, with a vampire very far from Bram Stoker's imagination.
The vampire is no longer someone living in the Carpathians. They can be our next-door neighbor. It doesn't drink blood, it has found substitutes, and it doesn't even mean ill to humans. So, is it still a vampire?
I sincerely believe that the author of Twilight betrayed the vampire. when she turned him into a sort of shiny piece of soap that can walk in the sun and spend his time in high school. Who'd like to spend 500 years in high school? To take the same biology class over and over? To pretend that a 500-year-old human could ever be interested in a girl like that, whose only form of expression is to do the dishes when she's angry. I really think it's an attempt to put everyone back in, quote, the right place. That is, women in the kitchen and men out hunting werewolves. It was a wave of conservatism that tried to gather all the figures of rebellion.
If people aren't afraid of vampires now, what's the point of them? I think there's currently a big rival taking his place. The zombie. Far more disgusting, and with whom we can't identify at all.
Is the vampire buried for good? Don't be too sure. Let's not forget that Dracula is eternal. We should expect to see him again. The second best-selling book of all time after the Bible, Bram Stoker's novel is never out of print, and no adaptation has yet exhausted the character's richness and complexity.